A priest stands by a river in exile, far from home, when the sky tears open. What he sees defies description. Living creatures with 4 faces, wheels within wheels covered in eyes, and a throne of fire surrounded by rainbow light. This is Ezekiel, and his message will shake nations. He'll eat scrolls that taste like honey but carry words of doom. He'll lie motionless for over a year, shave his head with a sword, and witness the unthinkable, God's glory abandoning his own temple. But in the darkest prophecies, a promise emerges. Dry bones will live again, and a river will flow from a new temple, bringing life wherever it goes. This is Ezekiel's story. The year was 593 BC, and Ezekiel was 30 years old. He should have been serving as a priest in Jerusalem's temple, but instead he found himself among the Jewish captives by the Kibar River in Babylon. Everything had been taken from him: his homeland, his calling, his future. But on one ordinary day, something extraordinary happened. The heavens opened. Ezekiel looked up and saw visions of God. As chapter 1 verse 4 describes, he saw a windstorm coming from the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the storm looked like glowing metal in the middle of fire. This wasn't a natural storm. Something was coming through it. Out of the center came 4 living creatures. They had a strange appearance, as verse 5 tells us. They looked like humans, but each had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like those of a calf, gleaming like polished bronze. Under their wings, they had human hands on all 4 sides. The faces were what made them truly remarkable. Verse 10 explains that each creature had the face of a human in front, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle at the back. Their wings spread upward, with 2 wings touching the wings of the creatures beside them, and 2 wings covering their bodies. These beings moved in a way Ezekiel had never seen before. As verse 12 says, each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they moved. They didn't need to turn because they had faces looking in every direction. Among the living creatures was something that looked like burning coals of fire, or like torches moving back and forth. The fire was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures darted back and forth like flashes of lightning, moving with incredible speed. Then Ezekiel noticed something else. As he looked at the living creatures, he saw wheels on the ground beside each of them. Verse 16 describes these wheels as sparkling like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel, wheels within wheels. But the most unsettling detail came in verse 18. The rims of the wheels were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. These weren't ordinary wheels. They were covered completely with eyes, watching in every direction at once. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. When the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose too. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, the creatures and wheels went together, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Above the heads of the living creatures was something that looked like an expanse, sparkling like crystal and awesome in appearance. The wings of the creatures stretched out under this expanse, and the sound they made was incredible. Verse 24 says that when they moved, the sound of their wings was like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. This was the throne chariot of God himself, appearing to his prophet in exile. The God of Israel wasn't confined to Jerusalem's temple. He had come to Babylon, to the river where his defeated people sat in despair, and he was about to speak. Above the expanse, over the heads of the creatures, there was something that looked like a throne made of lapis lazuli. Chapter 1, verse 26 describes what Ezekiel saw. High above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire. From his waist down, he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. The appearance of the surrounding light was like that of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. Verse 28 makes it clear, this was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When Ezekiel saw it, he fell face down on the ground. Then he heard a voice speaking. The voice called him Son of Man, a title that emphasized his humanity in contrast to the divine glory before him. As chapter 2 verse 1 records, the voice said, Son of man, stand up on your feet and I will speak to you. But Ezekiel couldn't move. He was completely overwhelmed by what he had seen. That's when the Spirit entered him. As soon as the Spirit came into him, it raised him to his feet, and he could hear the one speaking to him. The voice continued in verse 3. Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. God didn't sugarcoat the mission. He told Ezekiel straight that the people were obstinate and stubborn. Verse 4 says, The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Whether they listened or refused to listen, and God made it clear they were a rebellious people, they would know that a prophet had been among them. Then came a warning for Ezekiel himself. God told him in verse 6, Do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. The message wouldn't be popular. The people would resist it, but Ezekiel had to speak it anyway. God commanded him to speak his words to them, whether they listened or failed to listen, because they were rebellious. Then God gave him a specific instruction in verse 8. But you, son of man, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like that rebellious people. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. Ezekiel looked and saw a hand stretched out to him. In the hand was a scroll, which the hand unrolled before him. Chapter 2. Verse 10 describes what was written on it. On both sides were written words of lament and mourning and woe. This wasn't a message of comfort. It was a message of judgment, and Ezekiel was about to internalize it completely. God spoke again at the beginning of chapter 3. He said to Ezekiel, Son of man, eat what is before you, eat this scroll, then go and speak to the people of Israel. Ezekiel opened his mouth, and God gave him the scroll to eat. Then God said in verse 3, Son of man, eat this scroll I'm giving you, and fill your stomach with it. So Ezekiel ate it, and something unexpected happened. It tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth. The scroll was filled with words of judgment and sorrow, but when Ezekiel consumed it, it was sweet. God's word, even when it contains hard truths, has a sweetness to those who receive it genuinely. After he ate the scroll, God gave him further instructions. Verse 4 records the command, Son of man, go now to the people of Israel and speak my words to them. But God added an interesting detail. He told Ezekiel that he wasn't being sent to a people of obscure speech and strange language, but to the people of Israel. If God had sent him to foreign nations who spoke different languages, they would have listened to him. But the people of Israel would not be willing to listen, because they were not willing to listen to God himself. God warned Ezekiel in verse 7 that the whole house of Israel had hardened foreheads and stubborn hearts. But then came encouragement. God said in verse 8, I will make your forehead like the hardest stone, harder than flint. Do not be afraid of them or terrified by them, though they are a rebellious people. God told him to listen carefully to all the words he spoke and take them to heart. Then he was to go to his people in exile and speak to them, whether they listened or failed to listen. After this, the Spirit lifted Ezekiel up, and he heard behind him a loud rumbling sound, as the glory of the Lord rose from the place where it was standing. It was the sound of the wings of the living creatures brushing against each other, and the sound of the wheels beside them, a loud rumbling sound. The Spirit lifted him up and took him away. Verse 14 says, "He went in bitterness and in the anger of his spirit, with the strong hand of the Lord on him." He came to the exiles who lived at Tel Aviv near the Kebar River, and there, where they were living, he sat among them for 7 days, overwhelmed. After 7 days, the word of the Lord came to him again. God appointed him as a watchman for the people of Israel. Verse 17 records God's words, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel, so hear the word I speak and give them warning from me." God explained the weight of this responsibility. If he warned a wicked person that they would die, and Ezekiel didn't speak to warn them to turn from their ways, that wicked person would die for their sin, but God would hold Ezekiel accountable for their blood. However, if Ezekiel warned them and they didn't turn from their wickedness, they would die for their sin, but Ezekiel would have saved himself. The same applied to righteous people. If a righteous person turned from their righteousness and did evil, God would put a stumbling block before them and they would die. If Ezekiel hadn't warned them, they would die for their sin, and God would hold him accountable. But if he warned the righteous person not to sin and they didn't sin, they would live, and Ezekiel would have saved himself. This was the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry, a ministry of warning, of speaking difficult truths, of standing as a watchman on the wall while his people walked toward destruction. The hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel, and God told him to go out to the plain, where he would speak to him. So Ezekiel got up and went, and there he saw the glory of the Lord, just as he had seen it by the Kebar River. He fell face down again. Then the Spirit entered him and raised him to his feet. God spoke and gave him a strange command. He was to go shut himself inside his house. God told him in verse 25 of chapter 3 that people would tie him with ropes so he couldn't go out among the people. God would make his tongue stick to the roof of his mouth so he would be silent and unable to rebuke them, because they were a rebellious people. But when God spoke to him, he would open his mouth, and Ezekiel would say, "This is what the sovereign Lord says." Then came one of the most unusual prophecies in all of Scripture. God told Ezekiel in chapter 4, verse 1, "Now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it." This wasn't just a drawing exercise. God was commanding him to create a miniature siege. Verse 2 continues the instructions. "Then lay siege to it, erect siege works against it, build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it." Ezekiel was to act out the coming destruction of Jerusalem using a clay model. But it got stranger. God told him to take an iron pan and place it as an iron wall between himself and the city. He was to turn his face toward it, and it would be under siege, and he would besiege it. This was to be a sign to the people of Israel. Then came the truly difficult part. God said in verse 4, "Lie on your left side and put the sin of the people of Israel upon yourself. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side." God assigned him the years of Israel's sin according to the number of days he would lie there, 390 days, 1 day for each year. After completing this, he was to lie down again, this time on his right side, and bear the sin of the people of Judah for 40 days, 1 day for each year. Verse 7 says he was to turn his face toward the siege of Jerusalem with his arm bared and prophesy against it. God would tie him up with ropes so he couldn't turn from one side to the other until he had finished the days of the siege. But Ezekiel still needed to eat during this time. God gave him specific rations in verse 9. "Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side." He could eat 20 shekels of food a day, taken at set times, and drink about 1/6 of a hin of water. Then God added something that horrified Ezekiel. He was to eat the food as he would a loaf of barley bread, and bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel. God explained in verse 13, In this way, the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them. Ezekiel couldn't accept this. He said in verse 14, "Not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself. From my youth until now, I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No impure meat has ever entered my mouth." As a priest, he had kept himself ritually clean his entire life. This command went against everything he had practiced. God showed mercy. He said, "Very well, I will let you bake your bread over cow dung instead of human excrement." The point wasn't the specific fuel, but the message. Jerusalem would face such desperate conditions during the siege that normal life would become impossible. Food and water would be scarce, eaten in despair, because God would cut off the supply of food and water in Jerusalem. Verse 17 describes the result. People would waste away because of their sin. For over a year, Ezekiel lay bound, turning from side to side according to God's schedule, acting out the siege that was coming to his beloved city. The exiles watched him day after day, seeing their future played out in living prophecy. When the days of the siege ended, God gave Ezekiel another dramatic command. Chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take a set of scales and divide up the hair." For a priest, this was deeply significant. Priests were forbidden to shave their heads in normal circumstances, but Ezekiel was acting out prophecy, not following priestly regulations. He shaved his head and beard completely, then carefully weighed and divided the hair into 3 portions. God's instructions in verse 2 were precise. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair inside the city, take a third and strike it with the sword all around the city, and scatter a third to the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. But he was to take a few strands and tuck them away in the folds of his garment. Even from these few, he was to take some and throw them into the fire to burn. Then God explained what the hair represented. Verse 5 records his words, "This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations, with countries all around her." Jerusalem had been placed in a position of prominence, meant to be a light to the nations. But she had rebelled against God's laws and decrees more than the nations around her. She had rejected his laws and had not followed his decrees. Because of this, God declared judgment. He said in verse 8, "I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations." He would do things to Jerusalem that he had never done before and would never do again, because of all her detestable practices. The punishment would be severe. Verse 10 contains a disturbing prophecy. "Therefore in your midst parents will eat their offspring, and children will eat their parents. I will inflict punishment on you, and will scatter all your survivors to the winds." The siege would create such desperate famine that the unthinkable would happen. God explained what the 3 portions of hair meant. A third of the people would die by plague or perish by famine inside Jerusalem. A third would fall by the sword outside the walls, and a third would be scattered to the winds, with God pursuing them with drawn sword. This was the meaning of Ezekiel's strange haircut and the divided portions. God's anger would be spent on them. Verse 13 says, "Then my anger will cease, and my wrath against them will subside, and I will be avenged. And when I have spent my wrath on them, they will know that I, the Lord, have spoken in my zeal." Jerusalem would become a ruin and a reproach among the nations around her, a warning and an object of horror. The nations would mock when God carried out his sentence in anger and fury. Verse 16 describes it as deadly arrows of famine that God would shoot to destroy them. He would send more and more famine upon them and cut off their supply of food. He would send famine and wild beasts against them, leaving them childless. Plague and bloodshed would sweep through them, and he would bring the sword against them. This was the word of the Lord. spoken through shaved hair and a prophet's obedience. In the 6th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, in the 6th month on the 5th day, Ezekiel was sitting in his house with the elders of Judah before him. Chapter 8 verse 1 records that the hand of the sovereign Lord came on him there. He looked up and saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from his waist up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. The figure stretched out what looked like a hand and took Ezekiel by the hair of his head. The Spirit lifted him up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God took him to Jerusalem. He was transported to the entrance of the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before him was the glory of the God of Israel, just as he had seen in the vision by the Kibar River. God said to him in verse 6, "Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utterly detestable things the Israelites are doing here. Things that will drive me far from my sanctuary, but you will see things that are even more detestable." God brought him to the entrance of the court, and Ezekiel saw a hole in the wall. God told him to dig into the wall, and when he did, he saw a doorway. God said, "Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing here." So Ezekiel went in and looked. What he saw shocked him. All over the walls were portrayed all kinds of crawling things and unclean animals and all the idols of Israel. Standing in front of them were 70 elders of Israel, with Jaazaniah son of Shaphan among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. God asked him in verse 12, "Son of man, have you seen what the elders of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, 'The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land.'" The leaders of God's people were worshipping idols in secret, believing God had abandoned them or couldn't see what they were doing. But God wasn't finished showing him the abominations. He said in verse 13, "You will see them doing things that are even more detestable." He brought Ezekiel to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and there sat women mourning the god Tammuz. This was a pagan fertility deity, and the women of Israel were weeping for it at the very gate of God's temple. God asked, "Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this." He brought Ezekiel into the inner court of the house of the Lord. There, at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men. Verse 16 describes their posture. With their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, they were bowing down to the sun in the east. These men had turned their backs on God's temple, literally to worship the sun. God said in verse 17, "Have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the people of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually arouse my anger? Look at them putting the branch to their nose." The abominations weren't just happening in secret corners. They had penetrated to the very heart of the temple, to the inner court where only priests should stand. The leaders, the women, the men, all levels of society had turned to idolatry. They had filled the land with violence and continued to provoke God to anger. God's response was final. Verse 18 records his declaration, "Therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them." The time for mercy had passed. The abominations in the temple had sealed Jerusalem's fate. Judgment was coming, and nothing would stop it. After showing Ezekiel the abominations in the temple, God called out in a loud voice that Ezekiel could hear. Chapter 9, verse 1 records his words, "Bring near those who are appointed to execute judgment on the city, each with a weapon in his hand." Ezekiel watched as 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north. Each one had a deadly weapon in his hand. But there was a 7th figure among them. With the 6 men was another man clothed in linen, who had a writing kit at his side. They came in and stood beside the bronze altar. Then something significant happened. The glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim, where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple. God called to the man clothed in linen who had the writing kit. Verse 3 continues, and the Lord said to him in verse 4, "Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it." There were still some faithful people in Jerusalem, people whose hearts broke over the sin around them. These would be marked for protection. Then God spoke to the 6 executioners, and Ezekiel heard him. Verse 5 records the command, "Follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter the old men, the young men and women, the mothers and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary." The judgment would start at God's own house. They were to begin with the elders who were in front of the temple, the very men who had been worshipping idols in the inner court. God told them to defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain, then go out and begin killing throughout the city. So they went out and began killing. While the men were carrying out the slaughter, Ezekiel was left alone. He fell face down and cried out in verse 8, "Alas, sovereign Lord, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" The horror of what he was witnessing overwhelmed him. Would anyone survive? God answered him directly. He said in verse 9, "The sin of the people of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of injustice. They say, 'The Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see.'" The people had convinced themselves that God didn't see their actions or didn't care. They were wrong on both counts. God continued in verse 10, "So I will not look on them with pity or spare them, but I will bring down on their own heads what they have done." There would be no mercy for those who had shown no mercy, no compassion for those who had practiced injustice. The marked ones would be spared, but judgment would fall on the rest. Then the man in linen with the writing kit returned and reported back. He said in verse 11, "I have done as you commanded." The marking was complete. The faithful had been identified and sealed. Now the executioners could complete their terrible work. Ezekiel looked again at the throne chariot he had seen in his first vision. Chapter 10 verse 1 says he saw above the expanse over the heads of the cherubim something like a throne of lapis lazuli appearing above them. God spoke to the man clothed in linen and said, "Go in among the wheels beneath the cherubim. Fill your hands with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city." Ezekiel watched as the man went in. The cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man entered, and a cloud filled the inner court. Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. The sound of the wings of the cherubim could be heard as far away as the outer court. Verse 5 says, "It was like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks." When the Lord commanded the man in linen to take fire from among the wheels and from among the cherubim, the man went in and stood beside a wheel. One of the cherubim reached out his hand from among the cherubim to the fire that was among them. He took up some of it and put it into the hands of the man in linen, who took it and went out. The cherubim appeared to have what looked like human hands under their wings. Ezekiel looked and saw beside the cherubim 4 wheels, one beside each of the cherubim. The wheels sparkled like topaz. Verse 10 describes their appearance. All 4 looked alike, each appearing to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the cherubim faced without turning as they moved. The cherubim went in whatever direction the head faced without turning. Their entire bodies, including their backs, hands, and wings, were completely full of eyes, as were their 4 wheels. Verse 13 says, He heard the wheels being called the whirling wheels. Each of the cherubim had 4 faces. One face was that of a cherub, the second the face of a human being, the third the face of a lion, and the fourth the face of an eagle. The cherubim rose upward. These were the living creatures Ezekiel had seen by the Kibar River. When the cherubim moved, the wheels beside them moved. When the cherubim spread their wings to rise from the ground, the wheels did not leave their side. When the cherubim stood still, the wheels stood still. And when they rose, the wheels rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in them. The glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. Verse 19 records what happened next. While Ezekiel watched, the cherubim spread their wings and rose from the ground, and as they went, the wheels went with them. They stopped at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. These were the living creatures Ezekiel had seen beneath the God of Israel by the Kibar River, and he realized they were cherubim. Each had 4 faces and 4 wings, and under their wings was what looked like human hands. Their faces had the same appearance as those he had seen by the Kibar River. Each one went straight ahead. The coals of fire had been scattered over the city. Judgment from heaven itself had been released upon Jerusalem. The Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him to the gate of the house of the Lord that faces east. Chapter 11, verse 1 says that at the entrance of the gate were 25 men, and among them were Jaazaniah, son of Azur, and Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, leaders of the people. The Lord said to Ezekiel, "Son of man, these are the men who are plotting evil and giving wicked advice in this city." Verse 3 records their words. They say, "Haven't our houses been recently rebuilt? This city is a pot, and we are the meat in it." These leaders believed Jerusalem was like a cooking pot that would protect them, and they were safe inside like meat being cooked. They were completely wrong. God told Ezekiel to prophesy against them. So Ezekiel prophesied, and the Spirit of the Lord came on him. God gave him words to speak in verse 5. "This is what the Lord says. That is what you are saying, you leaders in Israel, but I know what is going through your mind." They had increased the number of people they had killed in the city and filled its streets with the dead. God declared in verse 7, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, the bodies you have thrown there are the meat, and this city is the pot, but I will drive you out of it." They feared the sword, but God would bring the sword against them. He would drive them out of the city and deliver them into the hands of foreigners, and he would execute judgment on them. They would fall by the sword at the borders of Israel, and then they would know that he is the Lord. The city would not be a pot for them, nor would they be the meat in it. God would execute judgment on them at the borders of Israel. Verse 12 declares, "And you will know that I am the Lord, for you have not followed my decrees or kept my laws, but have conformed to the standards of the nations around you." As Ezekiel was prophesying, Pelatiah, son of Benaiah, died. This happened right there, as the words were being spoken. Ezekiel fell face down and cried out in a loud voice, "Alas, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel?" One of the leaders had just dropped dead during the prophecy. The judgment was already beginning. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. God acknowledged what the people remaining in Jerusalem were saying about those in exile. Verse 15 records their words, "They are far away from the Lord. This land was given to us as our possession." The people in Jerusalem thought they were the favored ones, and those in exile were abandoned by God. But God had a different perspective. He told Ezekiel to say in verse 16, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone." God was with the exiles, not with those who remained in the sinful city. God promised to gather them from the nations and bring them back. Verse 17 says, I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. When they returned, they would remove all the vile images and detestable idols. God would give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. He would remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh, so they would follow his decrees and keep his laws. They would be his people, and he would be their God. But those whose hearts were devoted to their vile images and detestable idols, God would bring down on their own heads what they had done. This was the declaration of the sovereign Lord. Then the cherubim lifted their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. Verse 23 records the devastating moment. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. This was the Mount of Olives. The presence of God, which had filled the temple for centuries, was leaving Jerusalem. The Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him to the exiles in Babylonia in the vision given by the Spirit of God. Then the vision he had seen went up from him, and Ezekiel told the exiles everything the Lord had shown him. The glory had departed. Jerusalem was now just another city with no divine protection. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the start of chapter 12. God said, Son of man, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see but do not see, and ears to hear but do not hear, for they are a rebellious people. The exiles around Ezekiel were not paying attention to what God was showing them. God told him to act out another sign. Verse 3 says, Therefore, son of man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place. Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious people. Ezekiel was to pack his things as if going into exile during the day, while they watched, then leave in the evening as though going into exile. But there was more. While they watched, he was to dig through the wall and take his belongings out through it. He was to put them on his shoulder and carry them out at dusk, covering his face so he could not see the land. God said in verse 6, I have made you a sign to the Israelites. Everything Ezekiel did was a message, so Ezekiel did as commanded. During the day, he brought out his things packed for exile. Then in the evening, he dug through the wall with his hands. He took his belongings out at dusk, carrying them on his shoulders while they watched. In the morning, the word of the Lord came to him. God asked whether the Israelites had questioned what he was doing. Ezekiel was to tell them in verse 11, I am a sign to you. As I have done, so it will be done to them. They will go into exile as captives. The prince among them would put his things on his shoulder at dusk and leave through a hole dug in the wall. He would cover his face so he could not see the land. God would spread his net for him, and he would be caught in his snare. Verse 13 says, I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die. This was a prophecy about King Zedekiah, who would indeed be captured, have his eyes put out, and be taken to Babylon, where he would die without ever seeing the land. God would scatter to the winds all those around the king and pursue them with drawn sword. They would know that he is the Lord when he dispersed them among the nations. But he would spare a few of them from the sword, famine, and plague, so they could acknowledge all their detestable practices among the nations. Then they would know that he is the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. He was told to tremble as he ate his food and shudder in fear as he drank his water. He was to say to the people of the land in verse 19, This is what the sovereign Lord says about those living in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel. They will eat their food in anxiety and drink their water in despair, for their land will be stripped of everything in it because of the violence of all who live there. The inhabited towns would be laid waste, and the land would be desolate. Then they would know that he is the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel once more. God addressed a proverb the people were using in the land of Israel. Verse 22 quotes them, "The days go by, and every vision comes to nothing." The people had grown cynical. They thought the prophecies would never come true. God told Ezekiel to give them a new proverb in verse 23. "The days are near when every vision will be fulfilled." There would be no more false visions or flattering divinations among the people of Israel. God himself would speak what he would speak, and it would be fulfilled without delay. In their days, he would fulfill whatever he said. The people were saying that the vision Ezekiel saw was for many years from now, and he was prophesying about the distant future. But God declared in verse 28, "None of my words will be delayed any longer. Whatever I say will be fulfilled." The time had come. Chapter 13 begins with another word from the Lord. God told Ezekiel to prophesy against the prophets of Israel who were prophesying out of their own imagination. Verse 2 says to tell them, "Hear the word of the Lord." God pronounced woe on the foolish prophets who followed their own spirit and had seen nothing. These prophets were like jackals among ruins. Verse 5 declares, "You have not gone up to the breaches in the wall to repair it for the people of Israel, so that it will stand firm in the battle on the day of the Lord." Instead of interceding and calling the people to repentance, these false prophets gave them false hope. Their visions were false, and their divinations were lies. They said, "The Lord declares," when the Lord had not sent them, yet they expected their words to be fulfilled. God asked in verse 7, "Have you not seen false visions and uttered lying divinations when you say, 'The Lord declares,' though I have not spoken?" Because they led God's people astray, saying peace when there was no peace, God's hand would be against them. Verse 9 says, "My hand will be against the prophets who see false visions and utter lying divinations. They will not belong to the council of my people or be listed in the records of Israel, nor will they enter the land of Israel." When the people built a flimsy wall, these prophets covered it with whitewash, making it look strong when it was weak. God would tear down the wall they had covered with whitewash and level it to the ground. When it fell, the false prophets would be destroyed with it. God's wrath would be spent on the wall and on those who covered it with whitewash. God also spoke against the women who prophesied out of their own imagination. These women sewed magic charms on their wrists and made veils for people of every height to ensnare them. Verse 18 asks, "Will you ensnare the lives of my people, but preserve your own?" They had profaned God among his people for a few handfuls of barley and scraps of bread, putting to death those who should not die and sparing those who should not live. God would tear off their magic charms and veils and save his people from their hands. Verse 21 says, "I will save my people from your hands, and they will no longer fall prey to your power. Then you will know that I am the Lord." These false prophetesses had discouraged the righteous with lies and encouraged the wicked not to turn from their evil ways. God would stop them. Some of the elders of Israel came to Ezekiel and sat down in front of him. Chapter 14, verse 1 records this, "And then the word of the Lord came to him. God said these men had set up idols in their hearts and put wicked stumbling blocks before their faces." Verse 3 asks, "Should I let them inquire of me at all?" God told Ezekiel to speak to them and say that when any Israelite set up idols in their heart and came to a prophet, the Lord would answer them according to their great idolatry. He would do this to recapture the hearts of the people of Israel, who had all deserted him for their idols. God called them to repent. Verse 6 declares, "Repent, turn from your idols, and renounce all your detestable practices." When any Israelite or foreigner living in Israel separated themselves from God and set up idols in their heart, then came to a prophet to inquire of God, the Lord himself would answer them. He would set his face against them and make them an example, cutting them off from his people. If a prophet was enticed to utter a prophecy, God himself had enticed that prophet. and he would stretch out his hand against him and destroy him. Both the prophet and the one who inquired would bear their guilt. This was so the people of Israel would no longer stray from God or defile themselves with their sins. They would be his people, and he would be their God. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. God explained that if a country sinned against him by being unfaithful, he would stretch out his hand against it and cut off its food supply, sending famine upon it and killing its people and animals. Verse 14 says, "Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could save only themselves by their righteousness. The righteousness of a few could not save a nation bent on sin. If God sent wild beasts through that country and they left it childless, or if he brought a sword against that country, or if he sent a plague into it, even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, they could not save their own sons or daughters. They could save only themselves." God repeated this principle 3 times to emphasize it. Individual righteousness matters, but it cannot transfer to save the guilty. God applied this to Jerusalem. Verse 21 records his words, "How much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine and wild beasts and plague, to kill its men and their animals." Yet some survivors would be brought out, both sons and daughters. When the exiles saw their conduct and actions, they would be consoled regarding the disaster brought on Jerusalem. The survivors would console the exiles when they saw their conduct, and the exiles would know that God had not done without cause all that he had done in Jerusalem. This was the declaration of the sovereign Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel once more in chapter 15. God asked him a question in verse 2, "Son of man, how is the wood of a vine different from that of a branch from any of the trees in the forest?" It was a simple question with a profound point. Verse 3 continues the questioning. Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? The answer was obvious, no. Vine wood was useless for construction or tools. It was too weak and twisted. God went further in verse 4. "And after it is thrown on the fire as fuel, and the fire burns both ends and chars the middle, is it then useful for anything? Once burned, vine wood became even more worthless. If it wasn't useful before burning, it certainly wasn't useful after." God explained the meaning in verse 6. "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. As I have given the wood of the vine among the trees of the forest as fuel for the fire, so will I treat the people living in Jerusalem." Jerusalem was like vine wood, created for one purpose, to bear fruit. When it failed to bear fruit, it became completely useless. God would set his face against them. Verse 7 says, "Although they have come out of the fire will yet consume them. And when I set my face against them, you will know that I am the Lord." They had survived one judgment, being taken into exile, but that didn't mean they were safe. The fire would consume them still. God would make the land desolate because they had been unfaithful. This was the declaration of the sovereign Lord. The vine that produced no fruit would be burned. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel in chapter 16. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, confront Jerusalem with her detestable practices." What followed was one of the longest and most detailed prophecies in the book, a complete history of Jerusalem told as the story of an unfaithful wife. God began with Jerusalem's origins in verse 3. "This is what the sovereign Lord says to Jerusalem. Your ancestry and birth were in the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother a Hittite." Jerusalem had pagan roots. She wasn't born into God's people, but was adopted. Verse 4 describes her birth. "On the day you were born, your cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to make you clean, nor were you rubbed with salt or wrapped in cloths." No one looked on her with pity or had compassion to do any of these things for her. She was thrown out into the open field, despised on the day she was born. Then God passed by. Verse 6 records his words, I saw you kicking about in your blood, and as you lay there in your blood, I said to you, live. God made her grow like a plant of the field. She grew, developed, and entered puberty. Her breasts were formed and her hair grew, but she remained stark naked. God passed by again, and when he looked at her, he saw she was old enough for love. Verse 8 continues, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine. This was God's marriage covenant with Jerusalem. He bathed her with water, washed the blood from her, and anointed her with oil. He clothed her with an embroidered dress, leather sandals, fine linen, and costly garments. He adorned her with jewelry, bracelets, a necklace, a ring for her nose, earrings, and a beautiful crown. Verse 13 describes the result. So you were adorned with gold and silver, your clothes were of fine linen and costly fabric and embroidered cloth. Your food was honey, olive oil, and the finest flour. You became very beautiful and rose to be a queen. Her fame spread among the nations because of her beauty, which was perfect through the splendor God had given her. This was the declaration of the sovereign Lord. But then came the tragic turn. Verse 15 says, But you trusted in your beauty and used your fame to become a prostitute. You lavished your favors on anyone who passed by, and your beauty became his. She took some of her garments and made colorful high places where she carried on prostitution. She took the fine jewelry God had given her and made male idols for herself and engaged in prostitution with them. She took her embroidered clothes to put on them and offered God's oil and incense before them. The food God provided, the olive oil, honey, and finest flour, she offered as fragrant incense to these idols. Verse 20 declares, And you took your sons and daughters whom you bore to me and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? She slaughtered God's children and sacrificed them to idols. In all her detestable practices and prostitution, she did not remember the days of her youth when she was naked and bare, kicking about in her blood. After all her wickedness, verse 23 records God's words, Woe, woe to you! She built mounds for herself and made lofty shrines in every public square. At every street corner, she built her lofty shrines and degraded her beauty, spreading her legs to anyone who passed by. She engaged in prostitution with the Egyptians, her neighbors with large genitals, and aroused God's anger with her increasing promiscuity. God stretched out his hand against her and reduced her territory. Verse 27 continues, I gave you over to the greed of your enemies, the daughters of the Philistines, who were shocked by your lewd conduct. But she was still not satisfied. She engaged in prostitution with the Assyrians, and even after that, she remained unsatisfied. She increased her promiscuity to include Babylonia, but even with this, she was not satisfied. Verse 30 says, I am filled with fury against you. How weak-willed you are. When you do all these things, acting like a brazen prostitute. She was unlike other prostitutes. Verse 33 explains, all prostitutes receive gifts, but you give gifts to all your lovers, bribing them to come to you from everywhere for your illicit favors. She was the opposite. She paid her lovers instead of being paid. No one ran after her for her favors, and she was the very opposite because she gave payment instead of receiving it. God pronounced judgment. Verse 37 declares, I am going to gather all your lovers, with whom you found pleasure, those you loved as well as those you hated. I will gather them against you from all around, and will strip you in front of them, and they will see you stark naked. He would sentence her to the punishment of women who commit adultery and shed blood. He would bring on her the blood vengeance of his wrath and jealous anger. Her lovers would hand her over to rage. They would tear down her mounds and destroy her lofty shrines, strip her of her clothes, take her fine jewelry, and leave her stark naked. They would bring a mob against her, stone her, and cut her to pieces with their swords. They would burn down her houses and inflict punishment on her in the sight of many women. God would put a stop to her prostitution, and she would no longer pay her lovers. His wrath against her would subside, and his jealous anger would turn away. He would be calm and no longer angry, because she did not remember the days of her youth, but enraged him with all these things. Yet even in judgment, God remembered his covenant. Verse 60 says, "Yet I will remember the covenant I made with you in the days of your youth, and I will establish an everlasting covenant with you." When God made atonement for all she had done, she would remember and be ashamed. She would never again open her mouth because of her humiliation. This was the declaration of the sovereign Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel in chapter 17. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, set forth an allegory and tell it to the Israelites as a parable." What followed was a story with deep political meaning. God told the parable, "A great eagle with powerful wings, long feathers, and full plumage of varied colors came to Lebanon. Taking hold of the top of a cedar, he broke off its topmost shoot and carried it away to a land of merchants, where he planted it in a city of traders." This great eagle was Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The topmost shoot was King Jehoiakim, whom he had taken captive. Verse 5 continues, "He took one of the seedlings of the land and put it in fertile soil. He planted it like a willow by abundant water." The seedling was Zedekiah, placed on the throne as Babylon's puppet king. The seed sprouted and became a low, spreading vine. Its branches turned toward the eagle, and its roots remained under it. It became a vine and produced branches and put out leafy boughs. But then another great eagle appeared. Verse 7 says, "The vine sent out its roots toward him and stretched out its branches to him for water." This second eagle was Egypt. The vine turned to Egypt for help instead of remaining loyal to Babylon. God asked in verse 9, "Will it thrive? Will it not be uprooted and stripped of its fruit so that it withers? Even if transplanted, would it survive when the east wind struck it?" The vine that betrayed its planter would die. Then God explained the meaning. Verse 12 asks, "Do you not know what these things mean?" The king of Babylon had taken Jerusalem's king and nobles to Babylon. He made a treaty with Zedekiah, putting him under oath. But Zedekiah rebelled by sending envoys to Egypt for horses and a large army. God declared in verse 16 that Zedekiah would die in Babylon because he despised the oath and broke the covenant. Pharaoh would be of no help. God would spread his net, and Zedekiah would be caught and brought to Babylon. But God had a promise in verse 22, "I myself will take a shoot from the very top of a cedar and plant it." He would plant it on the mountain heights of Israel. It would produce branches and bear fruit and become a splendid cedar. Birds would nest in it, and all the trees would know that God brings down the tall tree and makes the low tree grow tall. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the beginning of chapter 18. God addressed a proverb the people kept using. Verse 2 quotes it, "The parents eat sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge." The people claimed they were being punished for their ancestors' sins. God declared in verse 3, "As surely as I live, you will no longer quote this proverb in Israel. Every living soul belonged to him." Verse 4 makes it clear, "The soul who sins is the one who will die." God gave an example. Suppose there is a righteous man who does what is just and right. Verse 5 lists his actions. He does not eat at mountain shrines or look to idols, does not defile his neighbor's wife, does not oppress anyone, returns pledges, gives food to the hungry and clothes to the naked. He does not lend at interest, withholds his hand from wrong, and judges fairly. Verse 9 concludes, "That man is righteous, he will surely live." But suppose this man has a violent son who sheds blood. Verse 11 says, "This son does none of those righteous things. He eats at mountain shrines, defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor, commits robbery, and does detestable things. Will he live?" Verse 13 answers, "He will not, because he has done all these detestable things. He is to be put to death. His blood will be on his own head." Now suppose this son has a son who sees his father's sins but does not do such things. Verse 17 declares, "He will not die for his father's sin. He will surely live." The grandson would live because of his own righteousness. The people might ask why the son doesn't share his father's guilt. Verse 19 explains, "Since the son has done what is just and right, and has been careful to keep all my decrees, he will surely live." If a wicked person turns from their sins and does what is just, they will live. None of their offenses will be remembered. The principle worked both ways. If a righteous person turns from righteousness and commits sin, they will die for it. The people complained God's way was not just, but verse 25 challenges them. "Is my way unjust? Is it not your ways that are unjust?" God would judge each person according to their own ways. Verse 30 says, "Repent, turn away from all your offenses, then sin will not be your downfall." They were to get a new heart and a new spirit. God asked, "Why will you die, people of Israel?" He took no pleasure in anyone's death. Verse 32 declares, "Repent and live." Ezekiel was commanded at the start of chapter 19 to take up a lament concerning the princes of Israel. Verse 2 begins, "What a lioness was your mother among the lions. She lay down among them and reared her cubs." The lioness represented Judah, and her cubs were the kings. She brought up one cub, and he became a strong lion. Verse 3 says, "He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater." This was King Jehoahaz. The nations heard about him and trapped him in their pit. They led him with hooks to Egypt. When the lioness saw her hope was gone, she took another cub and made him a strong lion. Verse 6 says, "He prowled among the lions, for he was now a strong lion. He learned to tear the prey, and he became a man-eater." This was King Jehoiakim. The land and all in it were terrified by his roaring. Then the nations came against him. Verse 8 says, "They spread their net for him, and he was trapped in their pit. They brought him to the king of Babylon and put him in prison, so his roar was heard no longer." The lament shifted imagery in verse 10. "Your mother was like a vine in your vineyard planted by the water. It was fruitful and full of branches because of abundant water. Its branches were strong, fit for a ruler's scepter. But it was uprooted in fury and thrown to the ground." Verse 12 continues, "The east wind made it shrivel. It was stripped of its fruit. Its strong branches withered, and fire consumed them. Now the vine was planted in the desert. Fire spread from one of its branches and consumed its fruit." Verse 14 declares, "No strong branch is left on it fit for a ruler's scepter." The royal line had been broken. The strong lions had been caged. The fruitful vine had been uprooted and burned. In the 7th year, in the 5th month, some elders of Israel came to inquire of the Lord. Chapter 20, verse 1 says they sat down in front of Ezekiel. Then the word of the Lord came. God told him in verse 3, "Son of man, speak to the elders of Israel and say to them, have you come to inquire of me? As surely as I live, I will not let you inquire of me." Instead, he told Ezekiel to confront them with their ancestors' detestable practices. God began reviewing Israel's history. Verse 5 says, "On the day I chose Israel, I swore with uplifted hand to the descendants of Jacob and revealed myself to them in Egypt." He swore to bring them out of Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey. He told them in verse 7, "Each of you, get rid of the vile images you have set your eyes on, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt." But they rebelled and would not listen. They did not get rid of their idols. God was about to pour out his wrath in Egypt, but he acted for the sake of his name. Verse 9 explains, I brought them out of Egypt for the sake of my name, that it should not be profaned in the eyes of the nations. He led them into the wilderness and gave them his decrees and laws. He gave them his Sabbaths as a sign. Yet verse 13 says, they did not follow my decrees but rejected my laws, and they utterly desecrated my Sabbaths. God was about to destroy them in the wilderness, but again he acted for the sake of his name. He swore he would not bring them into the promised land because they rejected his laws. God spoke to their children in the wilderness. Verse 18 records his words. Do not follow the statutes of your parents, or keep their laws, or defile yourselves with their idols. He told them to follow his decrees and keep his Sabbaths holy. But verse 21 says the children rebelled too. They did not follow my decrees, they were not careful to keep my laws, and they desecrated my Sabbaths. God withheld his hand and acted for his name's sake. He swore to disperse them among the nations because they had not obeyed his laws. God even gave them statutes that were not good. Verse 26 says, I defiled them through their gifts, the sacrifice of every firstborn, that I might fill them with horror, so they would know that I am the Lord. When they entered the promised land, verse 27 says, your ancestors blasphemed me by being unfaithful to me. They offered sacrifices on every high hill and under every leafy tree. From Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land, Israel had been in constant rebellion. God continued speaking to the elders. Verse 30 of chapter 20 says, will you defile yourselves the way your ancestors did and lust after their vile images? When they sacrificed their children and offered gifts to idols, should God let them inquire of him? He swore in verse 33, as surely as I live, I will reign over you with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with outpoured wrath. He would bring them from the nations and execute judgment face to face. He would examine them and bring them into the bond of the covenant. Verse 38 says, I will purge you of those who revolt and rebel against me. The word of the Lord came again in verse 45. He told Ezekiel to set his face toward the south and preach against the forest. Verse 47 records, I'm about to set fire to you, and it will consume all your trees, both green and dry. The blazing flame will not be quenched. Ezekiel responded in verse 49, alas, sovereign Lord, they are saying of me, isn't he just telling parables? The people thought he spoke in riddles. The word came again at the start of chapter 21. God told him in verse 2, Son of man, set your face against Jerusalem and preach against the sanctuary. There was no parable now. God declared in verse 3, I am against you. I will draw my sword from its sheath and cut off from you both the righteous and the wicked. His sword would be unsheathed against everyone from south to north. God told Ezekiel to groan in verse 6 with broken heart and bitter grief. When asked why, he was to say it was because of the news coming. Every heart would melt and every hand go limp. The word came again. God told him to prophesy in verse 9. A sword, sharpened and polished, sharpened for the slaughter, polished to flash like lightning. The sword was given to be grasped with the hand, made ready for the slayer. God commanded in verse 14, prophesy and strike your hands together. Let the sword strike twice, even 3 times. Hearts would melt and the fallen would be many. The sword was polished to flash like lightning. The king of Babylon stood at the fork in the road to use divination. Verse 21 says, he will cast lots with arrows. He will consult his idols. He will examine the liver. Into his right hand would come the lot for Jerusalem. God addressed the Prince of Israel. Verse 25 says, you profane and wicked Prince of Israel, whose day has come. He was to take off the turban and remove the crown. The lowly would be exalted, and the exalted brought low. Verse 27 declares, a ruin, I will make it a ruin. The word came to Ezekiel in chapter 22. God told him in verse 2, Son of man, will you judge her? Will you judge this city of bloodshed? Then confront her with all her detestable practices. Jerusalem had shed blood and made idols, becoming guilty and defiled. Inside her, people treated parents with contempt, oppressed foreigners, and mistreated orphans and widows. Verse 8 says, "You have despised my holy things and desecrated my Sabbaths." People accepted bribes to shed blood and took interest from the poor. God would strike his hands together at the unjust gain and bloodshed. He would disperse them among nations and put an end to their uncleanness. God looked for someone to stand in the gap on behalf of the land. Verse 30 says, "But I found no one." Chapter 24 brought the climax. Verse 1 says that in the 9th year, in the 10th month, on the 10th day, the word came to Ezekiel. God told him to record the date because on this very day Babylon had laid siege to Jerusalem. God commanded him to tell a parable. Verse 3 records, "Put on the cooking pot, put it on, and pour water into it." He was to put choice pieces of meat into it and pile wood beneath it. He was to bring it to a boil and cook the bones in it. This was against Jerusalem, the city of bloodshed. Verse 6 says, "Woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted whose deposit will not go away." The blood she shed was still on the bare rock, not covered, to stir up wrath. God would pile the wood high. Verse 10 says, "Heap on the wood and kindle the fire. Cook the meat well, mixing in the spices, and let the bones be charred." The pot would be set empty on the coals till it glowed, so its impurities would be melted and its deposit burned away. The impurity was lewdness. Verse 14 declares, "I, the Lord, have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity, nor will I relent." Then came the most personal prophecy. The word came saying in verse 16, "Son of man, with one blow I am about to take away from you the delight of your eyes. Yet do not lament or weep or shed any tears." He was to groan quietly and not mourn for the dead. Ezekiel spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening his wife died. The next morning he did as commanded. The people asked in verse 19, "Won't you tell us what these things have to do with us?" Ezekiel told them the word had come. Verse 21 records, "I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes. The sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword." They would do as Ezekiel had done, not mourning but wasting away because of their sins. Ezekiel would be a sign to them. On the day God took away their stronghold, a fugitive would come with news. Verse 27 says, "At that time your mouth will be opened, you will speak with him and will no longer be silent." The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the beginning of chapter 25. God's attention turned from Israel to the surrounding nations who had rejoiced at Jerusalem's fall. First came judgment on Ammon. God told Ezekiel in verse 2, "Son of man, set your face against the Ammonites and prophesy against them." He was to tell them to hear the word of the sovereign Lord. Verse 3 records God's words, "Because you said, 'Aha,' over my sanctuary when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel when it was laid waste, and over the people of Judah when they went into exile. Therefore I am going to give you to the people of the east as a possession." The people of the east would set up their camps and pitch their tents among the Ammonites. They would eat the Ammonite fruit and drink their milk. God would turn Rabbah into a pasture for camels and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Verse 5 declares, "Then you will know that I am the Lord." God explained why this judgment was coming. Verse 6 says, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, because you have clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel, therefore I will stretch out my hand against you and give you as plunder to the nations." The Ammonites had celebrated Israel's destruction with pure malice. Now they would be cut off and destroyed. Next came Moab and Seir. Verse 8 records God's declaration, This is what the sovereign Lord says, because Moab and Seir said, "Look, Judah has become like all the other nations. Therefore I will expose the flank of Moab, beginning at its frontier towns, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal-meon and Kiriathim, the glory of that land." God would give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession. Then the Ammonites would not be remembered among the nations, and God would inflict punishment on Moab. They would know that he is the Lord. Then God turned to Edom. Verse 12 says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because Edom took revenge on Judah and became very guilty by doing so, therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will stretch out my hand against Edom and kill both man and beast." He would lay it waste, and from Teman to Dedan they would fall by the sword. God would take vengeance on Edom by the hand of his people Israel. Verse 14 continues, "They will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. They will know my vengeance, declares the sovereign Lord." Edom had attacked Judah when she was down. Now Edom would experience God's full anger through Israel's hand. Finally came Philistia. Verse 15 declares, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah, therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines." God would wipe out the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. He would carry out great vengeance on them and punish them in his wrath. Verse 17 concludes, "Then they will know that I am the Lord when I take vengeance on them." 4 nations had mocked and attacked God's people. 4 nations would now face his judgment. Their malice would return on their own heads. In the 11th year, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Chapter 26 verse 2 records God's words about Tyre. "Son of man, because Tyre has said of Jerusalem, 'Aha! The gate to the nations is broken, and its doors have swung open to me. Now that she lies in ruins, I will prosper.'" Tyre had seen Jerusalem's destruction as a business opportunity. With Jerusalem gone, trade routes would shift to Tyre. But God had other plans. Verse 3 declares, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves." These nations would destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. God would scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. Verse 5 says, "Out in the sea she will become a place to spread fish nets, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She will become plunder for the nations. Her settlements on the mainland would be ravaged by the sword, and they would know that he is the Lord." God explained who would come against Tyre. Verse 7 records, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, from the north I am going to bring against Tyre Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, king of kings, with horses and chariots, with horsemen and a great army. He would ravage the settlements on the mainland with the sword. He would set up siege works, build a ramp, and raise his shields against Tyre's walls. He would direct the blows of his battering rams against the walls and demolish the towers with his weapons." Verse 10 says, "His horses will be so many that they will cover you with dust. Your walls will tremble at the noise of the war horses, wagons, and chariots when he enters your gates as men enter a city whose walls have been broken through. The hooves of his horses would trample all the streets. He would kill the people with the sword, and the strong pillars would fall to the ground. His army would plunder wealth and loot merchandise. They would break down walls and demolish fine houses, throwing stones, timber, and rubble into the sea." Verse 13 declares, "I will put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of your harps will be heard no more." God would make Tyre a bare rock, a place to spread fish nets. She would never be rebuilt. Verse 14 continues, "For I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. The nations would tremble when Tyre fell. All the princes of the coast would step down from their thrones, lay aside their robes, and sit on the ground trembling every moment, appalled at Tyre. They would take up a lament in verse 17, "How you are destroyed, city of renown, peopled by men of the sea. You were a power on the seas, you and your citizens. You put your terror on all who lived there." Now the coastlands would tremble on the day of Tyre's fall. The islands in the sea would be terrified at her collapse. God would make Tyre a desolate city, covered by the deep waters. Verse 19 says, "When I make you a desolate city, like cities no longer inhabited, and when I bring the ocean depths over you and its vast waters cover you, then I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of long ago." She would dwell in the earth below with those who went down to the pit. God would bring her to a horrible end, and she would be no more. Verse 21 declares, "I will bring you to a horrible end, and you will be no more. You will be sought, but you will never again be found," declares the sovereign Lord. The proud merchant city would sink into oblivion. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again in chapter 27. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, take up a lament concerning Tyre." He was to tell Tyre, situated at the gateway to the sea, merchant of peoples on many coasts, that this is what the sovereign Lord says. Verse 3 quotes Tyre's boast, "You say, Tyre, I am perfect in beauty." Her domain was on the high seas, and her builders brought her beauty to perfection. They made all her timbers of juniper from Sinir, and took a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for her. They fashioned her oars from oaks of Bashan, and made her deck of cypress wood from the coasts of Cyprus, inlaid with ivory. Her sail was of fine embroidered linen from Egypt, serving as her banner. Her awning was of blue and purple from the coasts of Elisha. Verse 8 says, "Men of Sidon and Arvad were your oarsmen. Your skilled men, Tyre, were aboard as your sailors." Veteran craftsmen of Byblos were on board to caulk her seams. All the ships of the sea and their sailors came alongside to trade for her wares. Men of Persia, Lydia, and Put served as soldiers in her army. They hung their shields and helmets on her walls, bringing her splendor. Men of Arvad and Helek guarded her walls on every side, while men of Gamad were in her towers. They hung their shields around her walls and brought her beauty to perfection. The list of her trading partners was extensive. Verse 12 says, "Tarshish did business with you because of your great wealth of goods. They exchanged silver, iron, tin, and lead for your merchandise." Greece, Tubal, and Meshech traded with her, exchanging slaves and bronze articles. Men of Beth Togarmah exchanged chariot horses, cavalry horses, and mules for her wares. The men of Rhodes traded with her, and many coastlands were her customers, paying with ivory, tusks, and ebony. Aram did business with her because of her many products, exchanging turquoise, purple fabric, embroidered work, fine linen, coral, and rubies. Judah and Israel traded with her, exchanging wheat from Minnith, confections, honey, olive oil, and balm. Damascus did business with her because of her many products and great wealth. Verse 18 says, "Because of your many products and great wealth of goods, they did business with you in wine from Helbon, wool from Zahar, and casks of wine from Izal in exchange for your wares, wrought iron, cassia, and calamus." Dedan traded in saddle blankets with her. Arabia and all the princes of Kedar were her customers, trading in lambs, rams, and goats. The merchants of Sheba and Ramah traded with her, exchanging the finest of all kinds of spices, precious stones, and gold. Haran, Caneh, Eden, merchants of Sheba, Asher, and Kilmad, traded with her, dealing in choice garments, blue fabric, embroidered work, and multicolored rugs. Verse 25 says, "The ships of Tarshish serve as carriers for your wares. You are filled with heavy cargo as you sail the sea." Her oarsmen took her out to the high seas, but the east wind would break her to pieces far out at sea. Her wealth, merchandise, and wares, her mariners, sailors, and shipwrights, her merchants, and all her soldiers, and everyone else on board, would sink into the heart of the sea on the day of her shipwreck. Verse 28 declares, "The shorelands will quake when your sailors cry out. All who handle the oars would abandon their ships." The mariners and all the sailors would stand on the shore, raising their voices and crying bitterly over her. They would sprinkle dust on their heads and roll in ashes. They would shave their heads because of her and put on sackcloth. They would weep over her with anguish of soul and bitter mourning. Verse 32 records their lament. "Who was ever silenced like Tyre, surrounded by the sea? When her merchandise went out on the seas, she satisfied many nations. With her great wealth and wares, she enriched the kings of the earth. Now she was shattered by the sea in the depths of the waters. Her wares and all her company had gone down with her. All who lived in the coastlands were appalled at her. Their kings shuddered with horror, and their faces were distorted with fear." Verse 36 says, "The merchants among the nations scoff at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more." The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel in chapter 28. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, say to the ruler of Tyre, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In the pride of your heart you say, I am a god. I sit on the throne of a god in the heart of the seas. But you are a mere mortal and not a god, though you think you are as wise as a god." The ruler claimed to be wiser than Daniel, with no secret hidden from him. Verse 4 continues, "By your wisdom and understanding you have gained wealth for yourself and amassed gold and silver in your treasuries." By his great skill in trading, he had increased his wealth, and because of his wealth, his heart had grown proud. God declared judgment. Verse 6 says, "Therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says. Because you think you are wise as a god, I am going to bring foreigners against you, the most ruthless of nations. They will draw their swords against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor. They would bring him down to the pit, and he would die a violent death in the heart of the seas." Verse 9 asks, "Will you then say, I am a god, in the presence of those who kill you? You will be but a mortal, not a god, in the hands of those who slay you." He would die the death of the uncircumcised at the hands of foreigners, for God had spoken. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. God told him in verse 12 to take up a lament concerning the king of Tyre. He was to say that this is what the sovereign Lord says. "You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." Verse 13 says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adorned you, carnelian, chrysolite and emerald, topaz, onyx and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared." This passage moved beyond the human ruler to a spiritual reality behind Tyre's pride. Verse 14 continues, "You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones." The king was blameless in his ways from the day he was created till wickedness was found in him. Through widespread trade, he was filled with violence and sinned. Verse 16 says, "So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones." His heart became proud on account of his beauty, and he corrupted his wisdom because of his splendor. God threw him to the earth and made him a spectacle before kings. By his many sins and dishonest trade, he desecrated his sanctuaries. Verse 18 declares, "So I made a fire come out from you, and it consumed you, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching." All the nations who knew him were appalled at him. He had come to a horrible end and would be no more. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel once more in verse 20 of chapter 28. God told him to set his face against Sidon and prophesy against her. Verse 22 records his words, "I am against you, Sidon, and among you I will display my glory. You will know that I am the Lord when I inflict punishment on you, and within you am proved to be holy. God would send a plague upon her and make blood flow in her streets. The slain would fall within her with the sword against her on every side. Then they would know that He is the Lord. No longer would the people of Israel have malicious neighbors who were painful briars and sharp thorns. Then they would know that He is the sovereign Lord. God gave a promise in verse 25. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They would live there in safety, build houses and plant vineyards. God would inflict punishment on all their neighbors who had maligned them. Chapter 29 begins a series of prophecies against Egypt. In the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th day, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Verse 2 says, Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. God told him to speak and say that this is what the sovereign Lord says. Verse 3 declares, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. You say, the Nile belongs to me, I made it for myself. God would put hooks in his jaws and make the fish of his streams stick to his scales. He would pull him out from among his streams, with all the fish sticking to his scales. He would leave him in the desert, both Pharaoh and all the fish of his streams. Verse 5 says, You will fall on the open field and not be gathered or picked up. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky. Then all who lived in Egypt would know that He is the Lord. Egypt had been a staff of reed for the people of Israel. When they leaned on Egypt, it splintered and tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on Egypt, it broke, and their backs were wrenched. Therefore God would bring a sword against Egypt and kill both man and beast. Verse 9 continues, Egypt will become a desolate wasteland. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Because you said, the Nile is mine, I made it, therefore I am against you and against your streams. God would make the land of Egypt a ruin and a desolate waste from Migdol to Aswan, as far as the border of Cush. The foot of neither man nor beast would pass through it, and no one would live there for 40 years. God would make the land of Egypt desolate among devastated lands, and her cities would lie desolate 40 years among ruined cities. He would disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them through the countries. Yet verse 13 says, This is what the sovereign Lord says, At the end of 40 years, I will gather the Egyptians from the nations where they were scattered. He would bring them back from captivity and return them to Upper Egypt, the land of their ancestry. There they would be a lowly kingdom, the lowest of kingdoms, never again exalting itself above the other nations. God would make it so weak it would never again rule over the nations. Egypt would no longer be a source of confidence for the people of Israel, but would be a reminder of their sin in turning to her for help. Verse 16 concludes, Then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord. In the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Verse 17 of chapter 29 says, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Every head was rubbed bare and every shoulder made raw. Yet he and his army got no reward from the campaign against Tyre. Therefore God would give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19 declares, He will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. God had given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts because he and his army did it for God. On that day, God would make a horn grow for the Israelites, and he would open Ezekiel's mouth among them. Then they would know that he is the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel in chapter 30. God told him to prophesy and say that this is what the sovereign Lord says. Verse 2 records, Wail and say, Alas for that day! For the day is near, the day of the Lord is near, a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword would come against Egypt, and anguish would come upon Cush. When the slain fell in Egypt, her wealth would be carried away, and her foundations torn down. Cush, Libya, Lydia, all Arabia, Cub, and the people of the covenant land would fall by the sword, along with Egypt. Verse 6 says, "This is what the Lord says. The allies of Egypt will fall, and her proud strength will fail. From Migdol to Aswan, they will fall by the sword within her. They would be desolate among desolate lands, and her cities would lie among ruined cities. Then they would know he is the Lord, when he set fire to Egypt and all her helpers were crushed." On that day, messengers would go out from God in ships to frighten Cush out of her complacency. Anguish would take hold of them on the day of Egypt's doom. God would put an end to the hordes of Egypt by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 11 declares, "He and his army, the most ruthless of nations, will be brought in to destroy the land. They will draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain." God would dry up the waters of the Nile and sell the land to an evil nation. By the hand of foreigners, he would lay waste the land and everything in it. He would destroy the idols and put an end to the images in Memphis. No longer would there be a prince in Egypt, and he would spread fear throughout the land. He would lay waste Upper Egypt, set fire to Zoan, and inflict punishment on Thebes. Verse 16 says, "I will pour out my wrath on Pelusium, the stronghold of Egypt, and wipe out the hordes of Thebes." He would set fire to Egypt, and Pelusium would writhe in agony. Thebes would be taken by storm, and Memphis would be in constant distress. The young men of Heliopolis and Bubastis would fall by the sword, and the cities themselves would go into captivity. Dark would be the day at Tahpanhes when God broke the yoke of Egypt. Verse 18 continues, "Her proud strength will come to an end. She will be covered with clouds, and her villages will go into captivity." God would inflict punishment on Egypt, and they would know that he is the Lord. In the 11th year, in the first month on the 7th day, the word came again. God had broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Verse 21 says, "It had not been bound up to be healed or put in a splint, so that it might become strong enough to hold a sword. Therefore God would break both of Pharaoh's arms, the good arm as well as the broken one, and make the sword fall from his hand. He would disperse the Egyptians among the nations and scatter them through the countries. He would strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put his sword in his hand. But he would break the arms of Pharaoh, who would groan before him like a mortally wounded man." Verse 25 declares, "I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon, but the arms of Pharaoh will fall limp." In the 11th year, in the 3rd month on the 1st day, the word came once more at the beginning of chapter 31. God told Ezekiel in verse 2, "Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, who can be compared with you in majesty? Consider Assyria, once a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches overshadowing the forest. It towered on high, its top above the thick foliage. The waters nourished it, and deep springs made it grow tall." Verse 5 says, "So it towered higher than all the trees of the field. Its boughs increased and its branches grew long, spreading because of abundant waters. All the birds nested in its boughs. All the animals gave birth under its branches, and all the great nations lived in its shade. It was majestic in beauty, with its spreading boughs, for its roots went down to abundant waters." The cedars in God's garden could not rival it, nor could the junipers equal its boughs. No tree in God's garden could match its beauty. Verse 9 declares, "I made it beautiful with abundant branches, the envy of all the trees of Eden in the garden of God. But because it towered on high and became proud, God gave it into the hands of the ruler of the nations to deal with according to its wickedness." Verse 12 says, "The most ruthless of foreign nations cut it down and left it. Its boughs fell on the mountains and in all the valleys. Its branches lay broken in all the ravines of the land. All the nations of the earth came out from under its shade and left it. All the birds settled on the fallen tree, and all the wild animals lived among its branches. Therefore, no other trees would reach such height or tower above the thick foliage. They were all destined for death, for the earth below, among mortals who go down to the realm of the dead. Verse 15 continues, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day it was brought down to the realm of the dead, I covered the deep springs with mourning for it. Lebanon was clothed with gloom because of it, and all the trees of the field withered away. God made the nations tremble at the sound of its fall when he brought it down to the realm of the dead. Then all the trees of Eden were consoled in the earth below. They too, like the great cedar, had gone down to the realm of the dead." Verse 18 asks, "Which of the trees of Eden can be compared with you in splendor and majesty? Yet you too will be brought down with the trees of Eden to the earth below. Pharaoh and all his hordes would lie among the uncircumcised, with those killed by the sword." The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the beginning of chapter 33. God spoke to him about the role of a watchman. Verse 2 says, "Son of man, speak to your people and say to them, when I bring the sword against a land, and the people of the land choose one of their men, and make him their watchman, and he sees the sword coming against the land, and blows the trumpet to warn the people, then if anyone hears the trumpet, but does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes their life, their blood will be on their own head. If they heard the sound, but did not heed the warning, their blood would be on their own head. But if the watchman saw the sword coming and did not blow the trumpet, and the sword came and took someone's life, God would hold the watchman accountable for their blood." God told Ezekiel in verse 7, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the people of Israel, so hear the word I speak and give them warning from me." When God said to a wicked person that they would surely die, and Ezekiel did not warn them, that person would die for their sin, and God would hold Ezekiel accountable. But if Ezekiel warned them, and they did not turn from their ways, they would die for their sin, though Ezekiel would have saved himself. God told him to say in verse 11, turn from your evil ways. Why will you die, people of Israel?" The righteous person's former righteousness would not save them when they did wrong. And if a wicked person turned from their wickedness, they would not fall because of it. If God told a righteous person they would surely live, but then they trusted in their righteousness and did evil, none of their righteous acts would be remembered. And if God said to a wicked person that they would surely die, but then they turned away from their sin and did what was just and right, that person would surely live. Verse 16 says, "None of the sins that person has committed will be remembered against them. In the 12th year of their exile, in the 10th month on the 5th day, a man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to Ezekiel and said, 'The city has fallen.' The evening before, the hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel, and he opened his mouth. So his mouth was opened, and he was no longer silent. Then the word came again. The people living in the ruins were saying in verse 24, 'Abraham was only one man, yet he possessed the land. But we are many. Surely the land has been given to us as our possession.' God told Ezekiel to say that since they ate meat with blood, looked to idols and shed blood, should they possess the land? God declared in verse 27 that those left in the ruins would fall by the sword, those in the country would be given to wild animals, and those in strongholds would die of plague. He would make the land a desolate waste. Then they would know that he is the Lord. God told Ezekiel that his people were talking about him, saying to each other, 'Come and hear the message that has come from the Lord.' They came and listened to his words, but they did not put them into practice. Verse 32 says, "Indeed to them you are nothing more than one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice and plays an instrument well, for they hear your words but do not put them into practice." The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the start of chapter 34. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? They ate the curds, clothed themselves with the wool, and slaughtered the choice animals, but did not take care of the flock." Verse 4 continues, "You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. The sheep were scattered because there was no shepherd, and they became food for wild animals. His sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill, scattered over the whole earth, with no one searching for them." God was against the shepherds and would hold them accountable for his flock. He would remove them from tending the flock and rescue his sheep from their mouths. God declared in verse 11, "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them." He would rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. He would bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, bringing them into their own land. Verse 14 says, "I will tend them in a good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land." God himself would tend his sheep and have them lie down. He would search for the lost and bring back the strays. He would bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and strong he would destroy. He would shepherd the flock with justice. God addressed the flock directly in verse 17, judging between one sheep and another. Was it not enough to feed on good pasture? Must they also trample the rest? Must his flock feed on what they had trampled and drink what they had muddied? God promised in verse 23, "I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them." God would be their God, and David would be prince among them. He would make a covenant of peace and rid the land of savage beasts so they could live safely. He would send down showers of blessing. Verse 27 says, "The trees will yield their fruit and the ground will yield its crops. The people will be secure in their land." They would no longer be plundered, and no one would make them afraid. The hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel at the beginning of chapter 37, and he brought him out by the Spirit and set him in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. God led him back and forth among them, and he saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. God asked him in verse 3, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answered, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." Then God told him to prophesy to these bones and say, "Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." God would make breath enter them, and they would come to life. He would attach tendons, make flesh come upon them, cover them with skin, and put breath in them. Verse 6 declares, "Then you will know that I am the Lord." So Ezekiel prophesied as commanded. As he prophesied, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. He looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then God said in verse 9, "Prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, and say to it, Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live." So Ezekiel prophesied, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Then God told him in verse 11, "Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, Our bones are dried up and our hope is gone, we are cut off." Therefore he was to prophesy that God would open their graves and bring them up from them. He would bring them back to the land of Israel. Verse 14 says, "I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it." The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel again. God told him in verse 16 of chapter 37, "Son of man, take a stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him." Then take another stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Joseph and all the Israelites associated with him. He was to join them together into one stick, so they would become one in his hand. When his people asked what he meant, he was to tell them that God would take the stick of Joseph and join it to Judah's stick. Verse 19 declares, "I will make them into a single stick of wood, and they will become one in my hand." He was to say in verse 21, "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." He would make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. There would be one king over all of them, and they would never again be two nations or divided into two kingdoms. They would no longer defile themselves with idols, for God would save them and cleanse them. They would be his people, and he would be their God. Verse 24 says, "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They would live in the land God gave to Jacob, the land where their ancestors had lived. They and their children's children would live there forever, and David would be their prince forever." God would make a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting covenant. Verse 27 declares, "My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Then the nations would know that he, the Lord, made Israel holy when his sanctuary was among them forever. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel at the beginning of chapter 38. God told him in verse 2, "Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him." He was to say that God was against Gog. God would turn him around, put hooks in his jaws, and bring him out with his whole army. Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Beth Togarmah would be with him, many nations. Verse 7 says, "Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you." After many days, he would be called to arms. In future years, he would invade a land that had recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all lived in safety. Gog would advance like a storm and come like a cloud covering the land. Verse 10 declares, "On that day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme." He would say he would invade a land of unwalled villages and attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people. He would plunder and loot and turn his hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods. Therefore God told Ezekiel to prophesy that when his people Israel were living in safety, Gog would take notice. Gog would come from his place in the far north with many nations, all riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. Verse 16 declares, "You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes." Verse 18 continues, "When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused. In his zeal and fiery wrath, there would be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. All creatures and people on earth would tremble at his presence. Mountains would be overturned, cliffs would crumble, and every wall would fall. God would summon a sword against Gog. Verse 21 says, "Every man's sword will be against his brother." He would execute judgment with plague and bloodshed, pouring down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and his troops. He would show his greatness and holiness and make himself known to many nations. God continued speaking at the start of chapter 39. He told Ezekiel to prophesy against Gog. God would turn him around and drag him along, bringing him from the far north and sending him against the mountains of Israel. He would strike his bow from his left hand and make his arrows drop from his right hand. Verse 4 declares, "On the mountains of Israel you will fall, you and all your troops and the nations with you. I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and to the wild animals." He would send fire on Magog and on those who lived in safety in the coastlands. God would make known his holy name among his people Israel. Verse 8 says, "It is coming, it will surely take place. Then those who lived in the towns of Israel would go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up. For 7 years they would use them for fuel. They would plunder those who plundered them. On that day, God would give Gog a burial place in Israel, in the valley east of the sea." Verse 11 continues, "It will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. For 7 months the Israelites would be burying them to cleanse the land." God told Ezekiel to call out to every kind of bird and all wild animals in verse 17, "Assemble and come together from all around to the sacrifice I am preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. There you will eat flesh and drink blood. They would eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of princes. At the sacrifice they would eat fat till glutted and drink blood till drunk." Verse 20 declares, "At my table you will eat your fill of horses and riders, mighty men and soldiers of every kind." God would display his glory among the nations. From that day forward, Israel would know that he is the Lord their God. And the nations would know Israel went into exile for their sin, because they were unfaithful. So he hid his face from them and handed them over to their enemies. Therefore God would restore the fortunes of Jacob and have compassion on all the people of Israel. Verse 28 declares, "Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. For though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind." He would no longer hide his face from them, for he would pour out his spirit on the people of Israel. In the 25th year of the exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city fell, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel. Chapter 40, verse 1 says, "He took him there. In visions of God, he took him to the land of Israel and set him on a very high mountain on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. He took him there, and Ezekiel saw a man whose appearance was like bronze. He was standing in the gateway with a linen cord and a measuring rod in his hand." Verse 3 records that the man said to him, "Son of man, look carefully and listen closely, and pay attention to everything I am going to show you. For that is why you have been brought here. Tell the people of Israel everything you see." Ezekiel saw a wall completely surrounding the temple area. The length of the measuring rod in the man's hand was 6 long cubits, each of which was a cubit and a handbreadth. He measured the wall. It was 1 measuring rod thick and 1 rod high. Then he went to the east gate. He climbed its steps and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 rod deep. The alcoves for the guards were 1 rod long and 1 rod wide, and the projecting walls between the alcoves were 5 cubits thick. The threshold of the gate next to the portico facing the temple was 1 rod deep. He measured the portico of the gateway. Verse 9 says it was 8 cubits deep, and its jambs were 2 cubits thick. Inside the east gate were 3 alcoves on each side. All had the same measurements, and the faces of the projecting walls on each side had the same measurements. He measured the width of the entrance to the gateway. It was 10 cubits, and its length was 13 cubits. In front of each alcove was a wall 1 cubit high, and the alcoves were 6 cubits square. Verse 15 says, "The distance from the entrance of the gateway to the far end of its portico was 50 cubits. The alcoves and the projecting walls inside the gateway were surmounted by narrow parapet openings all around. The faces of the projecting walls were decorated with palm trees. Then he brought Ezekiel into the outer court. There he saw some rooms and a pavement that had been constructed all around the court. There were 30 rooms along the pavement. He measured the distance from the inside of the lower gateway to the outside of the inner court. It was 100 cubits on the east side, as well as on the north. He measured the north gate leading into the outer court. Its alcoves, 3 on each side, its projecting walls and its portico had the same measurements as those of the first gateway. Verse 21 says it was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. 7 steps led up to it, with its portico opposite them. The man brought him to the south side, and he saw the south gate. He measured its jambs and its portico, and they had the same measurements as the others. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide. 7 steps led up to it, with its portico opposite them. It had palm tree decorations on the faces of the projecting walls on each side. Then he brought him into the inner court through the south gate, and he measured it. It had the same measurements as the others. Verse 29 says, "The gateway and its portico had openings all around. It was 50 cubits long and 25 cubits wide." He measured the court. It was square, 100 cubits long and 100 cubits wide, and the altar was in front of the temple. The man brought him to the portico of the temple and measured the jambs of the portico. They were 5 cubits wide on either side. Verse 49 declares, "The portico was 20 cubits wide and 12 cubits from front to back. It was reached by a flight of stairs, and there were pillars on each side of the jambs." Then the man brought Ezekiel to the main hall at the start of chapter 41 and measured the jambs. The width was 6 cubits on each side. The entrance was 10 cubits wide, and the projecting walls on each side were 5 cubits wide. He measured the main hall. It was 40 cubits long and 20 cubits wide. He went into the inner sanctuary and measured the jambs of the entrance. Each was 2 cubits wide. The entrance was 6 cubits wide, and the projecting walls on each side were 7 cubits wide. He measured the length of the inner sanctuary. It was 20 cubits, and its width was 20 cubits across the end of the main hall. Verse 4 records that he said to Ezekiel, "This is the most holy place." The man measured the wall of the temple. It was 6 cubits thick, and each side room around the temple was 4 cubits wide. The side rooms were on 3 levels, one above another, 30 on each level. The structure surrounding the temple was built in ascending stages, so that the rooms widened as one went upward. A stairway went up from the lowest floor to the top floor through the middle floor. The space above the outside of the entrance to the inner sanctuary and on the walls at regular intervals all around the inner and outer sanctuary were carved cherubim and palm trees. Palm trees alternated with cherubim. Each cherub had 2 faces, the face of a human being toward the palm tree on one side and the face of a lion toward the palm tree on the other. They were carved all around the whole temple. The main hall had a rectangular doorframe, and the one at the front of the most holy place was similar. Verse 22 says, "There was a wooden altar 3 cubits high and 2 cubits square. Its corners, its base, and its sides were of wood." The man said to him, "This is the table that is before the Lord." The man led Ezekiel out into the outer court and brought him to the rooms opposite the temple courtyard and opposite the outer wall on the north side. Chapter 42 verse 1 records this. "The building whose door faced north was 100 cubits long and 50 cubits wide. In front of the rooms was an inner passageway 10 cubits wide and 100 cubits long. Their doors were on the north." The man said to Ezekiel in verse 13, "The north and south rooms facing the temple courtyard are the priests' rooms, where the priests who approach the Lord will eat the most holy offerings. There they will put the most holy offerings, the grain offerings, the sin offerings, and the guilt offerings, for the place is holy." Once the priests entered the holy precincts, they were not to go into the outer court until they left behind the garments in which they ministered, for these were holy. They were to put on other clothes before they went near the places that were for the people. When he had finished measuring what was inside the temple area, he led Ezekiel out by the east gate and measured the area all around. He measured the east side with the measuring rod. It was 500 cubits. He measured the north side, 500 cubits. He measured the south side, 500 cubits. Verse 20 says, "Then he turned to the west side and measured. It was 500 cubits by the measuring rod." So he measured the area on all four sides. It had a wall around it, 500 cubits long and 500 cubits wide, to separate the holy from the common. Then the man brought Ezekiel to the gate facing east at the beginning of chapter 43. Verse 2 records what happened. "And I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. His voice was like the roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory." The vision was like the vision he had seen when God came to destroy the city, and like the visions he had seen by the Kebar River, and he fell face down. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside him, Ezekiel heard someone speaking to him from inside the temple. Verse 7 records the voice, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever." The people of Israel would never again defile God's holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death. Now they were to put away from him their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings, and he would live among them forever. Verse 10 says, "Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins. Let them consider its perfection." If they were ashamed of all they had done, he told Ezekiel to make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangement, its exits and entrances, its whole design and all its regulations and laws. He was to write these down before them, so they would be faithful to its design and follow all its regulations. Verse 12 declares, "This is the law of the temple. All the surrounding area on top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple." The man gave Ezekiel the measurements of the altar in long cubits. Verse 13 of chapter 43 describes its structure. From the gutter on the ground up to the lower ledge, it was 2 cubits high, and the ledge was a cubit wide. From this lower ledge to the upper ledge, it was 4 cubits high, and that ledge was also a cubit wide. Above that, the altar hearth was 4 cubits high, and 4 horns projected upward from the hearth. The altar hearth was square, 12 cubits long and 12 cubits wide. The upper ledge also was square, 14 cubits long and 14 cubits wide. The steps of the altar faced east. Then the man said to Ezekiel in verse 18, "Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says. These will be the regulations for sacrificing burnt offerings and splashing blood against the altar when it is built." He was to give a young bull as a sin offering to the Levitical priests of the family of Zadok, who came near to minister before God. Ezekiel was to take some of the bull's blood and put it on the 4 horns of the altar, and on the 4 corners of the upper ledge and all around the rim, and so purify the altar and make atonement for it. On the second day, he was to offer a male goat without defect for a sin offering, and the altar was to be purified as it was purified with the bull. When he finished purifying it, he was to offer a young bull and a ram from the flock, both without defect. Verse 24 says, "You are to offer them before the Lord, and the priests are to sprinkle salt on them and sacrifice them as a burnt offering to the Lord." For 7 days, he was to provide a male goat daily for a sin offering. At the end of these days, from the 8th day on, the priests were to present burnt offerings and fellowship offerings on the altar. Verse 27 declares, "Then I will accept you, declares the sovereign Lord." The man brought Ezekiel back to the outer gate of the sanctuary, the one facing east, and it was shut. Chapter 44, verse 2, records that the Lord said to him, "This gate is to remain shut. It must not be opened. No one may enter through it. It is to remain shut, because the Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it." The prince himself was the only one who could sit inside the gateway to eat in the presence of the Lord. Then the man brought Ezekiel by way of the north gate to the front of the temple. He looked and saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple, and he fell face down. The Lord said to him in verse 5, "Son of man, look carefully, listen closely, and give attention to everything I tell you concerning all the regulations and instructions regarding the temple of the Lord." The Levites who went far from God when Israel went astray would bear the consequences of their sin. Verse 11 says, "They may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people and stand before the people and serve them. But they were not to come near to serve him as priests or come near any of his holy things. But the Levitical priests, who were descendants of Zadok and who guarded the sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from God, were to come near to minister before him." Verse 15 declares, "They are to stand before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood." They alone were to enter his sanctuary and come near his table to minister before him. When they entered the gates of the inner court, they were to wear linen clothes. They were not to wear any woolen garment while ministering. They were to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waists. When they went out into the outer court where the people were, they were to take off the clothes they had been ministering in and put on other clothes. Verse 20 says, "They must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their heads trimmed." No priest was to drink wine when he entered the inner court. They were not to marry widows or divorced women. They could only marry virgins of Israelite descent or widows of priests. They were to teach God's people the difference between the holy and the common. The man brought Ezekiel back to the entrance of the temple at the beginning of chapter 47. Verse 1 says, "I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple toward the east," for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He brought him out through the north gate and led him around the outside to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and then led Ezekiel through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led him through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000 and led him through water that was up to the waist. Verse 5 says, "He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross." He asked Ezekiel, "Son of man, do you see this?" Then he led him back to the bank of the river. When Ezekiel arrived there, he saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. The man said to him in verse 8, "This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh." Swarms of living creatures would live wherever the river flowed. There would be large numbers of fish because this water flowed there and made the salt water fresh. So where the river flowed, everything would live. Fishermen would stand along the shore, from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There would be places for spreading nets. The fish would be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes would not become fresh. They would be left for salt. Verse 12 declares, "Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing." God spoke again to Ezekiel. Verse 13 of chapter 47 says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. These are the boundaries of the land that you will divide among the 12 tribes of Israel as an inheritance, with 2 portions for Joseph. He was to divide it equally among them. Because God swore with uplifted hand to give it to their ancestors, this land would become their inheritance." This was to be the boundary of the land. On the north side, it would run from the Mediterranean Sea by the Hethlon Road, past Lebo Hamath to Zedad, Berotha, and Sebraim. The boundary would extend from the sea to Hazar Enan, along the northern border of Damascus. This would be the northern boundary. On the east side, the boundary would run between Haran and Damascus, along the Jordan between Gilead and the land of Israel, to the Dead Sea and as far as Tamar. This would be the eastern boundary. On the south side, it would run from Tamar as far as the waters of Meribah Kadesh, then along the Wadi of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. This would be the southern boundary. On the west side, the Mediterranean Sea would be the boundary to a point opposite Lebo Hamath. This would be the western boundary. Verse 21 says, "You are to distribute this land among yourselves, according to the tribes of Israel." They were to allot it as an inheritance for themselves and for the foreigners residing among them. They were to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with them, they were to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. Chapter 48 lists the tribal allotments. Dan would have one portion extending from the eastern side to the western side. Asher would have one portion bordering Dan from east to west. Naphtali would have one portion bordering Asher from east to west. Manasseh would have one portion bordering Naphtali from east to west. Ephraim would have one portion bordering Manasseh from east to west. Reuben would have one portion bordering Ephraim from east to west. Judah would have one portion bordering Reuben from east to west. Bordering the territory of Judah from east to west would be the portion they were to present as a special gift. It would be 25,000 cubits wide, and its length from east to west would equal one of the tribal portions. The sanctuary would be in the center of it. The special portion they were to offer to the Lord would be 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. This would be the sacred portion for the priests. In the center would be the sanctuary of the Lord. The area remaining on both sides of the sacred portion would belong to the prince. The property of the Levites and the property of the city would lie in the center of the area that belonged to the prince. Verse 21 of chapter 48 says, "The area belonging to the prince would lie between the border of Judah and the border of Benjamin." As for the rest of the tribes, Benjamin would have one portion extending from the eastern side to the western side. Simeon would have one portion bordering the territory of Benjamin from east to west. Issachar would have one portion bordering the territory of Simeon from east to west. Zebulun would have one portion bordering the territory of Issachar from east to west. Gad would have one portion bordering the territory of Zebulun from east to west. The southern boundary of Gad would run south from Tamar to the waters of Meribah Kadesh, then along the Wadi of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. This was the land they were to allot as an inheritance to the tribes of Israel, and these would be their portions, declares the sovereign Lord. These would be the exits of the city, beginning on the north side, which was 4,500 cubits long. The gates of the city would be named after the tribes of Israel. Verse 31 says, "The three gates on the north side will be the gate of Reuben, the gate of Judah, and the gate of Levi. On the east side, which was 4,500 cubits long, would be three gates, the gate of Joseph, the gate of Benjamin, and the gate of Dan. On the south side, which measured 4,500 cubits, would be three gates, the gate of Simeon, the gate of Issachar, and the gate of Zebulun. On the west side, which was 4,500 cubits long, would be three gates, the gate of Gad, the gate of Asher, and the gate of Naphtali. The distance all around would be 18,000 cubits. Verse 35 declares the final words of Ezekiel's prophecy, "And the name of the city from that time on will be, The Lord is there." The valley of dry bones came to life. The divided kingdom became one. The river of life flowed from the temple, and the city's name became, The Lord is there. This is the God we serve, a God who never abandons his people, even when they abandon him. If this video helped you understand the book of Ezekiel in a new way, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another biblical story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that God specializes in bringing dead things back to life. And let me know in the comments which part of Ezekiel's vision impacted you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.